Greetings, Ken Woodward here. Welcome back to another episode of Curated Questions. Together, we engage inquisitive humans about how they use questions to navigate and make sense of our world. I am a fellow traveler and pilgrim on this journey, and I'm glad you're here. It was the morning commute from the Maryland suburbs into the heart of Washington, D.C. The crawl was stereotypical. Commuter sedans comprised the majority of my fellow traffic makers and owners of lit taillights. Interspersed among the fuel-efficient cars were the semi-trucks, making the painful slog around the beltway that encircles the nation's capital. I had time to reflect on the flatbed truck in front of me, piled high with prefabricated wall panels and roof trusses. Watching traffic that morning, I realized those wall panels carried more than lumber. They carried a metaphor. I could almost smell the fragrance of fresh-cut pine trees as I looked at the carefully constructed 2x4s adjoined in intricate patterns only an architect and building foreman could understand and appreciate. I considered how those pieces of wood, once erected, would enclose space that had never been confined before. This particular square footage on this particular planet, hurtling through space, had never experienced temperature control before. Never in all of history had a bird stood still on a roofline from that vantage point. Soon, a child would be playing with Legos in her room on the second floor, which used to be an unidentified point 15 feet in the air in a farmer's field. This is what a question does. Every question you ask, or fail to ask, is carrying something. Components, framing, assumptions, possibility. Most of us never think about what is on the truck. We don't exert the same care as the architects put into planning or the framers' skill at ensuring the walls are straight. We just answer the question we imagine, or mishear, or are handed, and move on. This episode is about learning to read the load. Every building begins with plans and a blueprint. Before the first wall panel is lifted off a flatbed truck, an architect has already made hundreds of decisions. Each is made to meet the builder's purpose, where the load-bearing walls go, which elements carry weight, and which are purely decorative. Questions have the same blueprint and architecture. When someone asks a question in a meeting, in a marriage, in a moment of crisis, that question arrives with a blueprint already drawn. That blueprint is made of assumptions. Most of us never ask to see it, nor do we recognize that it exists. We hear the words, we process the words, and we answer the words. We have learned that when asked a question, we must answer. We walk straight into the building, the world that question creates, without pausing at the door to ask who designed its blueprints or what was it built to hold. We feel the need to resolve the tension between question and answer as quickly as possible. The components of a question's architecture have a name: assumptions. Not in the casual sense, not the lazy shorthand for a guess. In architectural terms, assumptions are the load-bearing elements in the blueprint. Remove them, and the whole structure collapses. Consider a question that lives in almost every organization in America. How do we get our team more engaged? It sounds reasonable. It sounds responsible even. A leader who asks that question appears to be paying attention. But look at the blueprint. The question assumes that engagement is the variable that needs adjusting. It assumes the work itself is sound, and the people need to be brought up to meet it. It positions leadership as the unquestionable architects, and the team as the materials that need to be optimized. Every answer that question generates, better incentives, more recognition, clear communication, is built on that foundation. And if that foundation is wrong, every answer is wrong with it. What if the work is the problem? What if the question worth asking is not how do we get people more engaged, but whether this work deserves engagement in the first place? The moment you examine and change a load-bearing assumption, you are no longer in the same building. You are standing in an entirely different structure with different walls, different light, and a different view. That is what assumptions do. It determines what answers are even possible before a single word of response is spoken. Getting the question right matters. Equally important is hearing the question right. I learned this the hard way. It was during my walk. For those new to the show, several years ago, I walked every street and alley in Washington, D.C., 2,085 miles, wearing sandwich board signs and stopping to talk with anyone who would engage. The 3-foot by 3-foot yellow and black sign read, "Black and Brown Lives Matter." I was used to receiving shouts of both cheers and jeers. One particular afternoon, a young, friendly voice called out to me as he crossed busy Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue behind me. He asked a question I did not fully hear. "What about light-skinned lives?" I did not see who had spoken. I did not register the full question. What I heard, or thought I heard, was, "What about white-skinned lives?" Sadly, I answered the question I thought I heard. I said, "I'm not too concerned about them." 2 seconds passed. In that brief silence, my brain replayed the words spoken. I realized what had happened. To my horror, I turned around to see a light-skinned black teenager dribbling his basketball away from me. I tried to catch up, but he was already gone. The question he asked wasn't a challenge to the sign. It was about belonging, about whether he was truly seen, about whether a movement that claimed to see him actually did. He was asking in the way young people sometimes ask, sideways and searching, whether his particular experience of blackness had a place in the conversation I was inviting. As a middle-aged white guy, this mistake was all the more damning. My bias, built from earlier encounters, short-circuited my listening and filled the silence with a bad assumption. I had walked into the wrong building entirely. The assumption I carried was about the speaker. I assumed a white voice. I assumed a challenge. I built my answer on a foundation that had nothing to do with the question he was actually asking. And in 2 seconds, before I could correct it, I thrust up a wall where a door should have been. I don't know what he did with that. I don't know if he filed it away or if it confirmed something that he already suspected about who gets seen and who doesn't. What I know is that the harm was architectural. It was not a matter of intention. It was a matter of never checking the blueprint before I opened my mouth. That moment taught me something. Our assumptions aren't neutral. They carry weight. And when we rest that weight on the wrong beams, someone pays the cost. The load-bearing assumption collapsed, and someone got hurt in the rubble. What I learned that day wasn't just about one painful interaction. It exposed how much of my listening was being shaped by structures I didn't even know I had inherited. Last year, the director of the Right Question Institute's Legal Empowerment Program, Naomi Campbell, was on the podcast. She was describing the Right Question Institute, an organization whose methodology does something most of us have never considered. It teaches people who have been structurally excluded from power how to formulate their own questions. Not primarily focused on how to answer questions better, not how to navigate systems that were not built for them, how to ask, how to be the architect rather than the material. She described parents in under-resourced schools, patients navigating medical systems that don't speak their language, and communities shut out of the decisions that shape their lives. Questions that assumed compliance. Questions that were only allowed after the system had asked its own. A system that would only entertain feeble questions that demonstrated submission. Questions that positioned them as problems to be solved rather than people with agency. Questions whose load-bearing assumptions they had never been invited to examine, let alone challenge. And then someone handed them the tool. One client used the concepts to find her questions and press her lawyer into action to regain custody of her children. Naomi did not frame this as a question when she said it. She stated it plainly as a thing she knew to be true. Demonstrated through thousands of examples across the globe, the power of a question, she said, lies in agency. I got emotional. My response caught in my throat, and you can even hear it in the episode if you're listening for it. Not because the idea was unfamiliar. I'd been thinking about questions for nearly a decade. I had built an entire body of work around their power. But the framing she offered found something in me that my own thinking had not realized, a new dynamic. What she was describing was not a methodology. It was a redistribution, a transfer of architectural authority to people who had never been told they were allowed to draw a blueprint. The headlines are a continuum of examples of the powerful dominating the powerless. I had been treating questions as powerful tools. Naomi's observation reframed them as a primary means of agency. Not secondary, not supplemental, primary. The same way a door is not supplemental to a house. It is how you enter and leave on your own terms. The resonance I felt was not merely intellectual agreement. It was recognition. The question her observation built, the room it enclosed, was one I had been standing outside of without knowing it. And when I stepped inside, something settled. The Naomi Campbell moment teaches what the painful D.C. story cannot. In the engagement with a teenager, the wrong architecture caused harm. A misread assumption closed a door that should have opened wide. The consequence was external. A teenager dribbling his basketball away from a conversation that acutely failed him. Naomi's insight did something different. It did not ask me anything. It just named a truth. And that truth built a room I walked into without realizing I was moving. The consequence was internal. A room opened inside me that I could not close again. I now carry the view that questions are a primary means to agency with me, not as a lesson I learned, but as a room I live in. Same mechanism. A question's architecture meets a person. Different direction. One threw up a hurtful wall, the other took a wall down. The skeleton tells you what a question is made of. Resonance tells you what it's made for. Here's what the truck on the highway, the teenager on Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue, and Naomi Campbell's observation have in common. They are all about the built environment we inherited. The questions and structures you and I did not design. The wall panels on that flatbed were designed by someone before the truck ever left the yard. The assumption I carried onto Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue, that voice behind me belonged to someone defending the status quo, was not something I constructed in the moment. It was already there, installed by years of context, experience, and pattern recognition I had never examined. Naomi's insight was powerful precisely because it named something that had been true long before she said it. People she described have been living inside questions they did not design for as long as they could remember. Most of the questions that shape our lives were built by someone else. Not all of them, but more than we tend to admit. The question of whether you are capable enough, whether you are too much or not enough, whether the life you are living is the right size for who you actually are, whether you belong in the rooms you find yourself. These are not questions you sat down and drafted to ensure a life of thriving. They arrived framed, the load-bearing designation preordained, already determining what answers were possible before you ever could shape a question. It is the human condition. You moved in without reading the blueprint. This is not a reason for alarm. It's not an accusation. Every person lives with inherited architecture they did not choose. The question is not whether you're living inside someone else's frame. You are. We are. Everything we live in was once imagined by someone and then accepted as an unquestionable reality. Architecture is something someone like you or I dreamed up, drew a line in the dirt, and started construction. Someone thought it was a good idea. Most likely, it was built for their benefit. The question is whether you have ever paused long enough to notice. Most people haven't. Not because they lack intelligence or courage, because no one told them to look, because the rooms are well established and feel familiar, because familiar and true are not the same thing, but they feel identical from the inside. The practice I'm inviting you into is not demolition. You do not need to tear the building down. You do not need to declare every inherited question corrupt and start from rubble. What the Right Question Institute knows, what Naomi's work demonstrates across thousands of examples, is that the first act of agency is simply asking, not answering, asking. Turning toward the question you are living inside and saying, who designed this? What is this built to hold? Is this the right question for the life I am actually trying to build? You do not have to rebuild everything, but reading the blueprint and studying the construction is everyone's responsibility. And it's not a small thing. For many people, for the parents in under-resourced schools, for the patients navigating systems that were never built for them, for the communities whose questions were only permitted after the system had asked its own, being handed the right to ask is a form of liberation. Liberation is not only for those oppressed by current systems. Liberation is extended to those who benefit from existing systems. Those who think themselves immune have pulled the door closed behind them and locked themselves in a golden cage of their own making. All major religions command us to love our neighbors. A tangible demonstration of this love is to understand how the architecture favors you, then make adjustments so everyone can enjoy what the world has to offer. The room you're standing in right now was built by a question. Maybe one you asked, maybe one you inherited, maybe one you never examined. What would it mean to read its blueprint? Today, the truck is gone. Somewhere across the city or across the country, that building is going up right now. Framing crews are lifting wall panels into place. Roof trusses are being set. A structure is rising that will enclose space no one has ever occupied before. A roofline is taking shape that no bird has ever landed on. And somewhere, on a second floor that is still open sky, a child's room is being born. That is happening right now because someone read the blueprint, because someone understood the load-bearing elements before the first wall went up, because someone asked the right questions before the construction began. Each of us has the same capacity, not just to answer the questions you are presented with, but to pause before you answer, to stand at the threshold and ask, who drew the plans for this question? What is it built to hold? What are the load-bearing assumptions I'm about to put my full weight on? Do I trust that it is for my good? And can it hold my weight? That pause is not hesitation. Rather, it's the work of an architect. And sometimes, a question will find you the way Naomi's observation found me, not because you went looking for it, but because it rang true. When that happens, when something lands in your chest before your mind has caught up, don't rush past it. Engage with it. Let it settle. That is resonance. That's a question doing its deepest work. Exposed architecture reveals who built it and for what purpose. The original intention is still there, load-bearing, even when the building has been modified beyond recognition. Most of us spend our lives answering. This is an invitation to something that comes before the answer, to notice the room, to run your fingers along the door trim, to pause at the threshold, to ask whether it is one worth living in. Questions are not just tools, they are the rooms we inhabit. You have never stood at this exact place before, at this particular intersection of your experience, your history, in this moment. The room that the questions in front of you are building has never been built before. Not quite like this. Not with you inside it. That makes you the architect. What question are you currently living inside that you did not choose? And what would it mean to reclaim agency and examine its architecture? Sit with that question this week. And if it moves something in you, if it opens a room you did not expect, I would love to hear about it. And you know where to find me. The weekly Substack Curated Questions Dispatch is live. You can sign up on either Substack or from the Curated Questions homepage. Additionally, the homepage includes a link to record your Right Now question, which may be included in an upcoming episode. If you have found the show provides you value, please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment. And I can say, until I found myself on this side of the microphone, I didn't understand how much of a difference those actions actually do make. And that wraps up another episode. Drop in the comments section of your favorite podcast player the moments that will stick with you. To those on the other side of the speaker, thank you for being here. Gratitude shout out to Beauty Pill for the show's music and producer Ben Ford for the technical help. This episode was recorded on Piscataway land. Please engage with this episode in some manner. Download, follow, save, like, share, or comment about something that resonated. This action ensures we are engaging the questioning community. Until next time, keep questioning.